Hey, I'm just saying hello, good afternoon to everyone. We're going to start in just about 1 minute. Just let people filter in. So, Christian, how you doing this afternoon? Are you West Coast?
I'm on the West Coast, so it's still just before noon for me.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
how's the weather in your part of the world?
It's rainy and cold today.
Okay.
Can't really complain.
Well, we're based in the Northeast, so we're in the depths of January here, so no good weather to report from our end.
Yeah, I realize I'm never going to get any sympathy for the weather in California.
Rain in California falls pretty far down on the list of things to feel badly about.
Exactly.
Yeah,
So I'm not native to California, but I've lived here more than half my life. So I've
yeah,
learned that when people talk about the rain, you always say, "We need it. It's good. We
yeah.
need it."
That's great. Well, we're right at the top of the hour. I see people are still logging in, but if it's okay with you, Christian, I'm gonna kick us off here.
Okay.
Um, So really appreciate you being here with us. I want to introduce myself. I'm Nick Allen with Proximity Lab. We're a UX research strategy and design agency, and this event is part of our ongoing design conversation series. Our guest today is Christian Crumlish, who's going to talk about the relationship between UX and product management, something that we're quite excited about. Just a couple small housekeeping items. So the format that we're going to follow for today is to give Christian the podium for about 20 minutes or so. And then we want to open up the event for a AMA or Ask Me Anything style Q&A. So please start posing your questions at any point during his talk. You should see that there's a QA panel on the lower right part of your screen where you can enter your questions, but you can also see questions that other people have asked and elect to upvote those. That'll help me when we get to that section kind of moderate and figure out what are the hot topics. Very commonly asked question I'll try to address now, but I'm sure it'll come up again. Yes, we're going to record the event. We'll make the content available to everyone who registered straight afterwards. So, well, within a day or so, as long as it takes us to process it. And on that note, I want to welcome Christian Crumlish to the event. Christian is a seasoned product professional. He's a team leader. He's also an avid musician, and he hosts a vibrant community that explores the intersection of UX design and product management. He is the author of the book that is the basis for, I think, a lot of this talk today, Christian, but you're not talking exclusively about that. You can learn more about Christian at his really great website. It is at crumlish.me. I encourage people who want to learn more to go check that out. So Christian, thanks so much for being with us today. And I will say, as a UX agency, I feel like we really have a front row seat to a lot of the issues that you talk about, which, the harmony, the disharmony, some points of friction between UX design and product teams. So, on behalf of our whole team, we're really excited about having you here today. So thank you. And I think with that, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you. And I agree there. I think there is a high relevance here. I've been in and around the agency world myself at different times in my career and have definitely noticed, I'm sure anybody who's been in this business for, say, at least the last decade has seen a change from when consulting agencies that focused on UX did not have a product management practice or product management professionals. They didn't offer that as a consulting service because at that point, product management really was a very in-house focused specialty. You didn't do product management unless you were working on a product in a product shop, and there might be consultants, but they tend to help with the research or the design or something else. And then I think a lot of agencies started to realize, well, seems like related to what we do, and we could probably help with that too. Maybe there is a role for product expertise, that isn't always being the product manager who owns the product, that the same mix of skills have applications in a consulting context, or sometimes just in a collaborative cross-skilled team where not everybody has a title and a label that matches one specific skill set and would be the same for everybody universally. And research as well. When I first started working on this book, one of the titles we pitched, and it has a very pedestrian title. Sometimes you want to have like a poetic title and then a subtitle that spells it out. And I was like, no, let's just call this book what it is. This is a book about product management for people who do UX. And I just want to be literal about that. But, at one point, the working title was product management for UX designers. And I felt like that's a little restrictive. Some people may say, well, this doesn't speak to me because I'm a researcher, or even I'm an architect, or I'm a strategist, or something like that in UX. And I wanted to say, no, if you're coming from UX, and definitely including researchers, there is a conversation to be had about product management and how it all fits together. And I found that that's been true when I've taught workshops or given talks like this or something along those lines, that there's always a very substantial UX researcher component to the audience and to the conversation, not just audience, because that makes it sound like I've got all the answers, but in the conversation that we're having. I think it skews a little bit towards senior UX people, UXRs who've been running teams and start to notice that what the product manager does is quite adjacent to what they do a lot of the time. And they sort of think, maybe I could do that part too. Another name for this talk is Super Friends. There's a lot of pent up frustration and anxiety out there, made worse by the recent job cutbacks and things like that since COVID. But there was percolating along already. And one reason why my design and product community exists is to talk about the overlap between product management and UX, but also because I think that there's a lot of conflict that is often avoidable and that wastes an opportunity to get aligned and pulled together in the same direction. But we have to be realistic about why do people get frustrated and what's going on out there. I want to take one step back quickly and just sort of as a level set and to try to get us into the same terminology space, if nothing else, because lots of people, we all use these words, we hear them from each other, we adopt them, but we don't always map them to exactly the same connotation. The word product itself is controversial. I've been doing UX work long enough that I was doing it when there were no product managers around, and then I did it with product managers, and then I was tyrannized by product managers, and then I became a product manager. And so I've had all kinds of relationships to this concept, and I've interrogated it, and there's a lot of thoughtful ideas out there about it being not such a great frame. It's very commercial. It's very much focused on selling objects. It's ties you to a 20th century business concept or something like that. But I'm not always literal about the way I use terms, and sometimes you have to accept that there are terms of art that are now a shorthand for a set of practices that people are doing, and you can argue about semantics all day long, or you can ride the tiger and just try to direct it in some way. To me, when I grew up, this was a product. Product was on a shelf. It was industrial. Every single box of Tide was more or less the same. And in fact, you have to set up a factory and tool it. You have to machine your own parts to make the product consistently the same every time. You don't do continuous change, to the product. You don't every sprint make a little change to the Tide box in those days, certainly. But when we talk about a product today, sometimes we're talking about something more like this, which is on one level, it's the same product. It's washing detergent, it's got the same brand, same logo, same color scheme, owned by the same, giant corporation. But this isn't a box on a shelf. This is an interface for subscribing to having Tide pods or whatever sent to you, on some schedule that makes sense. And that's a product experience as well, but it's quite different from the one I grew up with. And these are the kinds of products that we tend to work with if we work in the digital space. So that's when I'm talking about products, I'm talking about something that might be thought of as a service. It might be something that you buy once or something you subscribe to. It might be packed, but it's about it being packaged in some useful way that solves a problem for you or does a job for you or fulfills a scenario for you in a way that you can access again and again. It's somehow commodified, packaged, and presented to you as a solution. So if we're working in the space and some of the things that we're making on the internet using software are products, And some of us are UX people doing research or design or other things like that, and others are product managers doing whatever product managers do. It's not always been 100% clear, how do those roles work together? Who does what? Who's in charge? What is the dominant frame if we've got competing mental models for what kind of work we do? And this brings me back to what I was saying at the start, which is that there is a certain amount of frustration out there. There's some pent up, it's almost like communication debt. A lot of assumptions have been made. Teams have been turned from UX teams into product teams with no explanation for what that means. People's titles are changed from UX designer to product designer without knowing what that means, or they're told that they're not the right kind of designer anymore because they don't have product experience, whatever that means. They may find themselves. So I've talked to a lot of people with lots of these titles and jobs and roles, and the frustration swings both ways because certainly there's bad actors out there and annoying people and tyrants and everything. I'll never deny that. There's certainly toxic situations, but more than half the time, the conflicts that I see are ones where there's no bad intent at all, where people are working with best intent, but bringing to bear assumptions that they carry from their past experiences about what their job is and what other people's job should be, and then inadvertently offending, frustrating, or running athwart each other. So you hear that on the UX side, it's hard to influence direction, product direction, or priority, or the details of requirements. Product managers sometimes feel like when they're talking to designers and researchers, they're having to like listen to a language they don't speak fluently, and it's taxing for them. There's a lot of ideals pushed out there about Silicon Valley style empowered product management teams that are focused on outcomes, and they're not feature factories, and then a lot of people look around and say, well, that sounds great, but on my team, the product manager gives us a bunch of tickets every sprint and we have to do them. And we're not doing any of that stuff that I read about in Medium or LinkedIn or in Marty Kagan's book or something like that. I think, the underlying point is that people assume what someone else's job is without always understanding it fully. And that the work has often not happened to talk those things through. It's easy. It can feel frustrating and again, sort of taxing to have to spend time working on how do we work. Always. Like, we always have to do that. We got to level set again. We got to have a charter for this team. We've got to make agreements on how to communicate. And the answer is yes, you do have to do that over and over again because people are different. It doesn't matter how it worked at your last place or how it's traditionally done where you are now. You still have to think about these specific people on this team and what are they carrying around in their heads, and what are they going to, how are they going to actually get work done together? And there's almost no way to do that without talking it through and looking for the potential problems before they start to happen. These things, if they don't get planned and worked out, then they come to the surface as problems when people inadvertently or unconsciously step on each other's toes and do things that offend or bother other people. It can be anything from telling a designer that they're going to make it pretty or something like that, to leaving somebody out of a conversation or claiming that what they do is trivial or not important. But the ways around this are the things you always have to do to try to get alignment with each other. You have to talk. You have to expose what your assumptions are. You've got to figure out where you don't actually agree and get to the root of the disagreement. You may have to have disagreements that cannot be resolved, and you may have to identify them and kind of cordon them off and go, this is one of the things we don't have an answer to yet. We're going to have to study that and keep talking about it. But all these other things are now clear. I like to do task sorting exercises, and I'll sort of show how that plays out in a minute. Now, I believe as a person who's managed teams and managed managers, that I always want the individuals who work together as a first effort to try to figure out their issues directly, to make plans to work together, and when they have problems, to try to negotiate solutions to those problems. But I accept that people aren't always empowered to solve the problems or don't have the skills to do it. So everybody needs to be able to, at some point, go to their boss and say, I cannot be successful the way I'm working right now on this team. I've tried to make it clear that I need things to be a certain way, and I'm willing to compromise, but I still don't get enough of what I need. Can you talk to the boss of that other person? And nobody wants to go tattling to the parent, but I mean, that's how it works. You have to do that at some level. And leaders have to say, okay, if it's gotten to this point, I probably haven't done enough work to tell my people or to coordinate with my counterpart about how they're going to tell their people how to work together. We haven't created an environment in which our individual contributors or people on the front line have what they need to figure out how to work together. So it's come up to us. That's a sign that we need to do more work. And you might have to go to your boss, the head of product or something sometimes, because you can't agree with your counterpart. So that's how. But like anything else you do iteratively with retros, with constant improvement, you have to approach how you work together the same way. When I talk about sorting, I've often done I'm not consulting very actively right now. I'm doing government work full time, but when I was actively consulting, I often found myself in these combined teams facilitating a task sorting exercise where you write down, and I've included at the end of the deck a version of this as a take home if people want to try it ever. There's a guide to how to do this, a quick one. But the idea is you jot down on stickies, usually as if you can do this in person or a virtual version, essentially all the roles and skills and tasks that need to happen on this team for this team to be successful. And then if the issue is what does the product manager do and what does the UX person do, you try to sort them out. You make an area on the board for each person, and you grab stickies and you put them where you think they go. Now, sometimes people will disagree. They'll say, you took a sticky over there, but I think this comes over under my heading. But I would say typically on average it varies, but around 60 to 70% of the things written down, it's pretty obvious who does what. And so you get all that sorted out. And that's nice actually, just to know, oh, there's a lot of areas of agreement. We agree you do this, we agree I do that. And then there's always some things in the middle. There's overlapping work that both are concerned with, and it's not always 100% clear who should be in charge, who has the skill, how it's done at this team, who are the right people on this actual group. But to move forward, there has to be some working agreement on those things. Okay, we disagreed. We both tried to grab that sticky. So is it a jump ball? Do we flip a coin? You're not going to win every argument, but you're going to have to come up with some for now agreement. Like I think the Agile Manifesto at one point refers to rough consensus and running code. So can you get rough consensus, just enough to do the next sprint, to do the next cycle? And then you can retro, did that work? Okay, on the next sprint, let me do that thing. I think I can do it better, but at least get to something for now. So you're not actually literally having different ideas about who was supposed to do what, and then getting mad at each other about things the other person wasn't even aware of. Get it up to the surface where you agree and where you disagree. Just doing that process is often informative, by the way. Okay, so a couple other things. I'm not going to read slides so you can get these slides, but just to hit a couple other main points and try to give folks some food for thought about what we could talk about in the Q&A phase, is that I'm going to go back to say this before. I really think user research and what product people sometimes call customer understanding or discovery or customer obsession, loosely, that is the area, that's the sweet spot for UX and product people getting aligned and being very effective together. And when there's a failure to be aligned around research, which is very common, it's a huge missed opportunity, and it tends to ripple through and continue to cause problems. Research not getting listened to, feeling like they don't have any influence, coming too late, research coming at a time that's sort of unwelcome to product people because decisions have been made, and it's really just saying, well, I wish you told me that earlier because we're doing this anyway, and you're just kind of, raining on my parade. And there's many ways this can go in the wrong direction. But if you can sit down together and say, okay, I have a model of research. It works this way. You make a plan, you make a strategy, you decide the modalities of research you need to do, depending on what it is you recruit, you gather information, you synthesize it. There's a process. You can explain it to the product manager. The product manager might say, oh, well, I come from the school of I'm supposed to call 10 customers every day, or once I have to make sure once a week I get out of the building and talk to customers, and and I'm trying to, and I ask them what they want me to build or something like that. And a researcher may say, oh, it's a dumb way to do research. You don't ask people what they want you to build. That's just like ticking a box that you've talked to people. But at that point, you're sort of, you're not respecting necessarily the way they've been taught to do things. And if there's a way instead to say, oh, okay, that will yield some interesting information. What I do yields this kind of information. Maybe we can align. Maybe I can join you on some of those customer calls. Maybe you can help me put together the research plan. And you may have some questions you're trying to answer that I can include as I put together my research questions. That's an opportunity to maybe educate the product manager on the difference between the question you ask and the research question that you're trying to solve, because product managers sometimes conflate those two things. But if you do that early work of getting into an agreed, shared model of how we do our research that respects the expertise and the point of view of each person and tries to kind of marry them together, then you can kind of rather than trying to pitch research to the product person or the product person trying to incorporate research somewhere along a process, it's not like that kind of delivering to each other model. It's more like just being a team that did stuff together and has developed a shared understanding, is now using that as a vocabulary to do your work. And I also think that a thing that the UX person can bring to the collaboration that can help the product person understand in some ways one of the values of the UX skill set is this idea of what I call, what I associate from my training with information architecture, but you can call it data visualization or diagramming or map making or sense making, things like service blueprints, customer journeys. There's a, we can all probably rattle off a number of artifacts that UX people know how to make that help to take a concept, a human-centered concept about how a technology or a service should work, and make a picture of it or make a flow or sort of articulate it visually in a way that people can consume, that's better than a list of requirements or some bullet points or even running code sometimes where all you can see is the screen you're on and the flow you're doing right now. I've made tons of these things as a UX person, as an information architect years ago, and as a product manager, I am always looking for the best person on the team for that kind of stuff. And then I make them my buddy and we make diagrams together because I need them to understand what I'm doing. And I need them to communicate to everybody else what we're doing. In the same way, like in war games, when they stand around that scale model of the battlefield and they push little pictures of tanks around or whatever, not to be military, but like any kind of a model of the thing that you're doing, you've got to have that shared idea or else people are picturing a different thing when you're talking about a priority or a direction to go in. And then the other thing I'd say is that and this may not be a problem in the consulting environment, I see it in-house more often, which is that there's still these ideas of some skill is used early and some skill is used late, and different disciplines that I've worked with and around and even jobs I've had in the past have their own version of I don't get consulted at the right time. Engineers often feel like they're left out and then just handed a bunch of requirements and not included in the actual thinking through what to build. Others feel like they're brought in too soon. I don't want to go to some research session, just tell me what to build, and then you have to realize who you're working with and how they want to be involved. Designers have classically felt like we don't have a seat at the table. UX designers, we weren't included. The strategy was handed down. Priorities were already made. You might be surprised knowing that product managers have that own version of not always feeling included and that things are handed down to them from the powers that be. But one thing we can do on teams that we organize ourselves is to think of the team collectively as a mixed group with crossing skills, all of whom have something to contribute to the overall idea. Of course, some will be involved more than at some times. During the course of a project, the engineering tends to get heavier later, and the research tends to be heavier sooner, and the design work tends to peak at a certain point and then become more about QA and fit and finish. So I think we all understand those patterns, but I think it's wrong to think, well, we won't even talk to the designer till halfway through. And I think if you've ever been a designer, you know what that's like. If you're in charge of organizing the team, think of having everybody involved, even if some sort of cycle in and out in terms of the level of their involvement, so that you're not having to kind of start over all the time. Couple of last points sort of to take home before we just throw this more wide open. And when I have both UX practitioners and product managers in a room together, which I think we probably have some of both here, I kind of like to try to say a similar thing, but using the language of one and the language of the other. And it's a kind of a subtext that you've probably heard before, which has to do with taking the things that you're already good at, what I like to call your superpowers, but the things that your job requires of you. And typically they're the skills in our business that are used to understand a customer's needs, to understand where they're coming from, to meet their needs, to make things work better for that customer than the way the product currently does or the way the competition does it. We all have our skills for doing that kind of thing. UX people do it by interviewing people, researching users, learning what their aspirations and goals are, learning what repels them and what they're afraid of, understanding the words they use, so that instead of feeling like they should learn the words of your business or your technology, realizing you should learn the words they use and tell them that you serve that purpose, and meet them where they are. all of those things, if you're a UX person and you're having challenges working with a product counterpart, try on that lens. Think of them the way you think about customers, as someone who speaks a different language, whose needs are not always being met by the process that you're doing right now, and neither are yours. So it's like when you're trying to improve people not converting or not using your product or not using your interface. And try to learn a little bit more about what's a win look like for them. What are their motivations? What's driving? What incentives are they being given? And also, what are the risks that they're afraid of that they've experienced in the past or that are hallmarks of a dangerous situation for them? So you don't accidentally give them the feeling you're creating that situation. And learn their lingo, even if you're like, well, that's business talk, that's dumb. I'm an artist, I'm creative. If you talked about your customers that way, you'd immediately see that that's not constructive. But why do your colleagues get any less respect than that? And it cuts the same way with product managers. Product managers pride themselves on being obsessed with the customer, and you start modeling and understanding the customer and meeting their needs. And it's like, guess what? Your partners that you work with, your colleagues with other skills, they're your customer too. You have to do customer service internally, not just for the people who want to give you money, because the work that you do in-house is going to actually create the product that goes out there and the results that you get. So if you're thinking about your customers' jobs to be done and how to meet their needs, well, what are your UX partners' jobs to be done, and how can you meet their needs? It's the same sort of thing. If you're good at understanding, the business landscape and what your technology can do and can't do, then that might be part of what you can be informing your design colleagues about. If you feel like they come to you with stuff that doesn't take into account those other things that you do, that's because you haven't filled them in on enough of it to incorporate that into their thinking. We don't need to shelter designers and say they're just creative people. They don't need to know about our need to make filthy money to keep the doors open. They do need to know that. They may need to know that something they think is a cool experience is actually not going to move the needle and isn't the most important thing to work on. And it's not because we're all crass, but because we've got to keep the lights on in our business. So it's essentially the same message both ways, which is how to meet people's needs so that they will have a better experience and continue to like make use of the service that you provide in one way or another. Try that with your colleagues. If you're having trouble getting the kind of results that you're hoping for. So just a couple final points. I've been asked again and again in various ways, like, should the product manager make wireframes? Should designers be involved in research? Like definitions about who should do what, and there is no one answer. There's broad patterns that make sense that you can apply, but it really comes down to the actual team. You have to sit down and talk through these things. Sometimes when you say, where's the line between product and UX, you'll get an answer like, well, we don't want a line because a line implies silos. And what we want is interpenetration and overlap. And that is true. You do want that. And in fact, there is always going to be overlap between these roles because they're highly adjacent to each other. But when we talk about lines, they have more to do with who has the final say. Everybody has an opinion, but on certain tasks or decisions, somebody has to choose. And when it's more design oriented, you want the UX designer making the decision. And then let's say when it's maybe more business oriented or involves other factors, the product manager may have the final say. It doesn't mean both sides aren't informed and have opinions and have something to contribute. But it is important sometimes to define working arrangements about, people do that with Casey, Racy, all those different tools, but just something about who gets to make this decision so you don't cycle around together. I firmly believe that if you can figure that stuff out, what you realize suddenly is that there's now two people at the table who have a very shared agenda, meeting customers' needs, making great software that people want to use, and can be allies when pushing against some of the other constraints and priorities that always have to be balanced to get stuff done, as opposed to sort of wasting energy in a kind of sibling battle that then ends up not really influencing the rest of the team, the leadership team. So at that point, I am going to stop babbling and see whether we've got any questions or anything, any prompts, anything to talk about.
No, that's really great, Christian. Yeah, absolutely. No babbling going on there. That's all really practical advice, I think, for both UX people and for product people. And I see questions coming in on the panel, but a place that I'd like to start is there's a persona that you don't in that particular talk, as it's focused on the collaboration between those two groups, there's another persona at the table, and it's the design leader, I'm going to say, and there could be even more, right? There are other representatives who have a say in this process, but I know that we have some design leaders on this call. So looking at it from their perspective, like what advice would you give them in terms of how to assemble, develop, and manage product design teams, inclusive of UX as part of them?
Um, no, that's a really good question. I'm going to stop my slides for now, just so I can look at people.
Sure.
Zoom slides if we need to. I mean, the first thing I would say is that it's really important that leaders take that seriously as part of their work. Like it's the equivalent of saying that you can't just grab a team as a team. You can't just say, "Hey, we're a team now," and start working on something. You have to do that kind of forming of the team work and some basic level setting and agreement setting. In the same way, I think leaders can't just say, "All right, I've hired some professionals. They know what to do. I'm going to give them work assignments." You have to be actively negotiating with your counterparts, or at least with your leadership, which either approves or disapproves of how you want to do things. But you have to lay out very consciously your expectations, and you've got to give some guidance. You don't necessarily have to have all the same answers. So the first thing is if you're a UX leader and there's a equivalent product leader that sits sort of next to you, there's work you have to do with that person that is, as I said, sort of analogous to that team level work that individual contributors have to do. I mentioned that the ICs may have to escalate to you, but that's just sort of from their point of view, the sequence. Ideally, leaders, as I said, aren't passively waiting till something starts going wrong before realizing, oh yeah, we should have given the troops a game plan there. We hope they would figure it out, and now they're having trouble. So I guess, kids need a guardrail or something like that. That's a passive way of leading, right? And happens in the breach sometimes when you have many other priorities that are taking all your attention. But I think it's important to acknowledge if it does get to that point, do a little introspection and say, okay, this is a bit of a failure. I kind of dropped the ball. I let it fall through, and I hoped that the team would pick it up. Now they're struggling, so I'm overdue in doing this. Now I don't mean to be negative, because at any point you can say, okay, it's been a while. Why don't we have the talk? Why don't we just talk again about, I'm not sure we're in alignment. So there's a thing about getting alignment across disciplines, which has to happen at the leadership level, or else frankly, when they escalate back up to you, it's not going, you don't have anything to give them because you're like, yeah, I agree. That product guy's a jerk. It's like, okay, that doesn't help them. You have to have an answer. There's a parallel. I mean, you have to be cute, but like, it's like a fractal. If you're like, this product person really thinks design works for product. They really think that, and it's such a dominant frame that I cannot get them to listen to me about how design and product are peers and have separate areas of expertise, and design actually has to have more authority over certain questions. If that's a sticking point, then it really is something you have to go to the boss, which might be a CEO or it might be a CPO. It might be somebody with a product title, which can feel like a disadvantage at that point because you're like, well, they're just going to side with their product head. In reality, all these things sometimes come up against a ceiling where you're like, in this org or with this leadership, I can only do this much because they're not bought in, and you can influence up, but you have to at some point judge, can I move the needle here enough to make enough room to do the kind of work I want to do? Or if I realize that there's a way of thinking and working that is coming from the top in the place I work now or in the environment I'm in right now, that is going to constrain me. And then you really have to figure out your exit strategy or something like that. Not to get too far down that road, but constructively, I think leadership, just literally saying, first of all, to the peers, and you need to do this with engineering leads too, by the way. I mean, that's a whole other, obviously, part of the story, but it's quite similar. And sometimes sit down and have conversations about things that you probably think are obvious because you've been around a long time and you probably do share a lot of assumptions. Like, frankly, leaders don't have as many confusions typically about who does what in unspoken assumptions. They generally are a little bit more on the same page because there's ideally kind of a shared understanding at that first team level about the main point of things and the distribution of jobs. But that doesn't mean, I mean, again, an engineering lead who came up fully through an engineering org, a product lead who maybe has not a very UX oriented background, maybe has a business or engineering background. It's quite possible that they could be in a leadership role and still have some kind of unreconstructed ideas about what designers do or what, UX UI or like things like that they might say. And there's some patient work you sometimes have to do with a peer. Again, not shaming them. Oh, you don't use the current terminology, or like, hey, it hurts my feelings when you say make it pretty or whatever like that. Yeah, or that your team is going to make it pretty or whatever. I think, but you have to put in that work. It's interpersonal work to bring figure out where the person is and bring them closer to your understanding. That's necessarily like an investment in the climate for your team. Because again, whatever you're able to achieve is the ceiling. They're not going to have any more success than you can make space for them to have. So you're sort of fighting, fighting is the wrong word because it's contentious, but you're like striving to create a shared understanding at the leadership level of the point and the value and the role of, in this case, let's say UX. And it doesn't sit still. It's an ongoing.
Yeah.
Once you get some level set, and then you can sort of just do maintenance on it.
Cool. I want to ask one quick follow-up on that. Then I'm going to go to the well from some really good questions that are coming in from the audience. So there's a little bit of a sense of you know and feel when it's working, and you know and feel when it's not.
Yeah.
And that it really gets at the heart of my question is around metrics and measuring success. So is there a way that teams can reconcile different perspectives to design any meaningful metrics for success? And, can you share any of those or give examples that you've seen?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. I know what I understand the idea. I mean, certainly I think we've all been on, I'm guessing if you've been doing this kind of work long enough, you've had the experience of teams that seem to work smoothly and get a lot done and aren't contentious, and other teams that aren't as good in some of those ways. So there's some level of like, it when you see it, you can sort of tell a happy team from a
Yeah.
dysfunctional team, and it's almost just like human nature, I think. Then again, we all vary in our awareness of that kind of stuff. But as a leader, hopefully you pay attention to those things. Having said that, I think one of the things I've failed at in the past as a product manager occasionally is noticing a problem kind of on a different level of attention than I've been paying attention to. So a team that's sort of chugging along fine sprint to sprint, but is not really making adequate progress towards the ultimate goal, or is losing focus. I've occasionally fooled myself by the like moment to moment happiness and smooth functioning and getting alongness of the team to be a little asleep at the wheel at something that was a building up problem that wasn't yet, kind of catching my peripheral attention. So that's just one thing about not relying totally on your intuition. I don't have like a nice quick canned set of like North Star metrics or something to use to determine how
Yeah.
functional your team is. And there is a real issue sometimes both in figuring out measurable outcomes that come close enough to what you're doing to be attributable to them. But at a high level, I think you have to connect how all the, and this is getting into like, this is really about team performance. This
Yeah.
is more a high functioning team versus a less well functioning team. The hallmark of a high functional team on some level is that they're achieving the outcomes, the overarching outcomes, and so it should roll back up to that. Like we need to deliver something for our client, or we need to get more people to sign up for the thing, or we've got to reduce customer service complaints around this confusing flow that we shipped earlier. There ought to be everything, all the work that's being done ought to be aimed towards some outcome, and there should be some way to measure it. So, I mean, I know this is generic, but it kind of goes without saying, hopefully. The trick then is to say work that we're doing to affect how the team works. And I literally think like after every sprint, when you retro, it's not so much about what did we build, it's about how did we work together and how can we work together better. Should be tied like anything else, like any other pivot decision based on, okay, are we getting closer to our goal? Like are we accelerating towards? Are we making better progress by whatever ongoing metric we're checking? But I don't, I don't think there's anything more crystallized than that. I mean, in some ways, I'm sort of
Yeah.
saying, well, you brush your teeth and exercise, and get a lot of sleep.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. That's cool. I'm going to merge a couple of questions here that I got, and I'm going to use Amy's. So the question is, which I think is a great one, is around, so we have things like design systems maturing rapidly and becoming more efficient. We have AI playing a part in helping, design interface. There are other changes, people losing jobs. So, can you speak to that for a minute? And the specific question is, do you feel design folks need to move closer to the business or be left behind? All right. So there's a couple different topics you could answer there, but there's a lot of other questions. So, yeah, have at it.
Okay, I'll try to connect the dots a little and we can unpack it more if we need
Okay.
to. So I'd say if designers work in the private sector. If you're a designer working in the private sector, if if your motivation to do UX design or work, to do UX work is on some level financial. I'm not saying we're all mercenary or something, but if you're not, like you could be a starving artist, maybe you're using your design skills to do technology and you're getting paid a very substantial salary, like that's an appeal for a lot of us, right? Oh, I get to be creative and I get paid. What a cool job. That's why people are flooding into this field. That's why maybe during this downturn, there's a correction and it's harder to get work right now or to get promotions in this space. Um, what comes along with that is an understanding that the reason why they want to pay you like a banker, pay you like $250,000 or something like that or maybe whatever, a couple $100,000 to do design work is because they think that's going to make money for their business, or for the client, whoever you're doing it for. They're not paying you because they love your art or something. They're paying you because they think you're a machine to make money for them. So on some level, yes, if you work in business and you work in the private, I think that I think the design identity is a very self-flattering identity sometimes, and I'm calling myself out along with everybody else. We like to feel like creative people. We like to feel like we're not the same as those other business people. We're thinking about the user and the human-centered thing. We're empathetic, we're very caring. We're special. We're not like those grubby bean counters and they're obsessed with money, whatever. But we're not doing social work. We're working in tech and we're getting really well paid. So I think there's a part of what we're doing that's a little bit our identity that we like to have and the reality of the kind of work you do that's for money, are at odds. And I think that sometimes designers do themselves a disservice by feeling like the money part is irrelevant or that it's wrong or crass to be like letting that decide what we build or what kind of interfaces we have or things like that. Um, and so on some level, just as a design constraint and as a material that you work with in the private sector, I think UX people do need to have more savvy about that. And it's definitely a kind of a thrust of my book. And career-wise, I think it does make you more viable because you're more attentive to the value of what you're doing, the value as other people see it, not just as you see it. Um, and frankly, at times it might enable you to slide into a different hat or redefine yourself. That's not for everyone, but in my career, I've had a lot of different titles. I always feel like I'm repackaging more or less the same aptitudes and skills and just putting them into a frame that people are now paying for or that they like to see the work done. So to develop those adjacent things like awareness of business, awareness of data, awareness of growth, concerns and things like that, I think gives a little more resilience potentially to your career. The
Yeah.
questions of AI and design systems, I think there's some concerns about commodification and abstraction away of knowledge work like design, like UX design and UX strategy and research. Um, I think there'll always be a human component, which sounds great, but maybe not as many jobs for sure. So um, for years, folks like Jared Spool and others were saying we've got to get lots and lots of people into UX because it used to be, well, maybe you had a website or you were a technical company, but now every enterprise in the world has not just a website, but has internet functionality threaded through everything they do. So there's clearly a need. There's this growing need for people who know how to make an interface or how to figure out how software should work that's internet enabled and everything like that. But at the same time, there was clearly not enough people to do all that stuff. So there had to be a correction at some point where the system automates some of that or scales it up. And so these waves are going to keep happening. I think the trick in knowledge work has always been to try to stay ahead of the curve and be one of the people who operates the new machine rather than is replaced by the machine. But that's a tough competition. And so it is going to shake some people out, I'm sure.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for doing that. So there's a clearly a trend to, and you talked about at the beginning, where UX people are voluntarily or being pushed into UX roles. And
Product roles.
all the work that you talk about is great, that they pull a set of all the fundamental UX skills, bring them into they have those to rely on. I guess where I'm going is that there's a psychological component of this too, which is that we've all experienced it. You can have really amazing UX practitioners on your team. They're really thoughtful designers, problem solvers, etc., that aren't particularly good in meetings. They're not particularly good, with clients. They do something really well. They're being put in a position where I would say that people who excel as product managers, almost anyone in an organization needs facilitation, communication, compromise. There's a bunch of soft skills that go into that. So what I mean, again, do you see that? And what advice do you give people with sort of self-assessing where they should be? Because it's really not for everybody, right? Right, moving
Definitely
into,
not.
into that
Yeah.
role.
I don't think
Yeah.
everybody should do product or be a product manager. I think if you work in a product environment, even if you're, in other words, if the software you're working on, and we're usually talking about software here, but they call it the experience you're working on, is being framed as a product. If there's product managers in the room, I think even if you've fully got a UX title and role, I would still think about yourself as a person who works on products and is a product designer or a product
Mhm.
researcher, just so that you speak the lingo and you can have a shared conversation with the people who are kind of driving the main frame that you're talking in. But I 100% agree that it's not for everyone. Like I would think of it this way. UX design itself is a very wide spectrum of skills and practices, right? And we all know people who are UX designers who can't draw. Right? And we all know UX designers who are like amazing visual artists and very good at other aspects of UX. They're not simple, they're not usually not just a graphic designer who could only do print, which is a perfectly valid career choice too, but they tend to have an understanding of interaction design, or they understand how the front end works a little bit, or they just have some skills that relate to the other aspects of UX. They understand how to use research, even if they don't know how to do research. So there's always been people who place themselves at different parts along the spectrum. And similarly, the more product management oriented work is more suitable for some people than others. And it's not necessarily that same exact line, but individually, as you said, and what we've often, for most of my career, called soft skills, I've sort of taken recently to calling fundamental skills
Yeah.
instead, because it can be gendered and all these other things. But basically, just this idea that like actually this is not about the vertical of my technical skill. This is a human skill that is going to be useful across many different, business or organizational contexts. So as you say, being able to facilitate a meeting, sort of knowing what to say in a
Mm.
meeting and what not to say,
Yeah.
understanding stakeholders and their concerns. Again, for some people, that's their worst nightmare. That is not the job they want to do. And I don't
Yeah.
think we should push everybody into that. We need to
Yeah.
make spaces where people can do what they excel at and thrive at. And some people need to like, just let me at my Figma, or just let me write code, or just let
Yeah.
me do the thing. That's cool. But you also, certainly for the people that are interested in that and have an aptitude for it, it opens a lot of doors. In some ways, it's a pathway to leadership.
Yeah. That's great. I'm going to pull in one of the audience questions that came in really early that I think is related to this. With a lot of the observations that you have around, providing, consulting services to teams about getting along, are you speaking to multi generations of workers? I would include myself in this, that we've been around for a little while and experienced different types of work and environments and seen a lot of changes. But the specific question is this fundamental disconnect between product and UX generational? Or are you seeing things different? If people are entering it now, are they coming in with what you characterized as just sort of foundation requirement skills as part of their jobs? And are they in a better position? Are you seeing a trend like that?
I don't know that I wouldn't, I'm not sure I could say that it's generational, strictly, at least not strictly speaking. One thing is that it's quite varied. I mean, there's these overall patterns, and you can kind of see them if you follow LinkedIn, the trends that people are talking about these days. But there's this very widely different lived experience on the ground everywhere. And so every time there's a conversation about UX and product at each other's throats, you will see somebody saying, I don't know what you're talking about. I've always loved every UX person I've ever worked with, or I've always loved my product manager. So there are these harmonious teams where people have it together and they're like, what is this? And they may feel like old people are arguing and we're young or we know how to do this. But I don't think it's quite generational. I think that the generational aspect that I see is that there have been these waves of new titles, new frames, new ways of talking about the work, and that they've sometimes displaced older ways. And so one generational effect can be a person who came up with and benefited from and thrived on a particular paradigm, feeling pretty disadvantaged if that paradigm is now dismissed or subsumed into something else. And I gave a talk at the European IA Summit a year or two ago where I reminded folks of back in my day when information architecture for a while was sort of the term that was closest to what we mean when we say UX now. It was kind of an all-encompassing term for that person who figures out what we're going to build, but isn't going to write the code or do, even necessarily the pixel pushing. And and then interaction design was an ascendant term, and it started eating the lunch of IA because people wanted things that were interactive, not just information related to each other. And that was a dominant model. And people who felt like some people said, okay, fine, I'll do interaction design. It's basically the same. And they had no problem with that. And other people felt their identity being marginalized until IA was just treated as a small part of UX or a small part of interaction design. And I think the same thing, some UX people who came up through UX titles and UX authority have felt this encroachment of the product world suddenly coming in and becoming more of a dominant frame and claiming it does UX or knows what UX is, but in a way that seems to not really fully appreciate it and marginalizes real UX. So I've been around long enough that, we want to talk about generational change, that I've seen a very similar pattern happen more than once. And so I think people can feel like they're on one or the other side of that based on what was true when they came up and what used to work for them and is not starting to work for them so well anymore. But I wouldn't strictly put it into something like generations.
Yeah, that's great. Shifting gears a little bit, there's the question that is specific to UX research, but I would also add a component of overall timing. So when you're trying to orchestrate, I think, design work between UX teams and product teams, all of us live in imperfect worlds, right? You don't just get to start with with a company and an idea and map things out perfectly. We all spend a lot of our times being reactive and dynamic, I think is probably the polite modern way to say it. So I think the question is specific to UX research, but I think you can expand on different disciplines, which is, how do you suggest getting started introducing things like UX research, generative usability, to a product life cycle? So you're going to have teams, probably product teams, that say, we didn't anticipate that, we don't need to do it, it's out of scope, out of time frame, it's going to increase costs, et cetera. What's your take on that?
Yeah, that's a really interesting fundamental question, because we're getting back to like, how do you make the case for UX at all? And it reminds me again of what I was saying about the uneven nature, the patchwork of the way this is done all over the world. Like there's spots where it's done this way, and there's spot, and another thing you might experience if you work long enough is sometimes you arrive in a situation and you're like, oh my goodness, they're doing this the way I used to do this 10 years ago. They're still doing it that way, and that can be both frustrating. Like you're like, oh no, I have to teach them what Agile is. I have to teach them all these things. And on the other hand, you're sort of like the person who knows what the stock market's going to be next year. You've come from the future, and you can tell them all these valuable things they need to do and kind of trade on that. So there's sort of that leveling up work that needs to be done. But yeah, if you're trying to introduce a practice like UX research into a shop that doesn't do it yet, that is a long-term process that involves planting seeds, building a case for it, not overpromising, being patient in some ways, figuring out some way to pilot an idea that will get a win and will whet the appetite, and folks say, oh wow, can we do that? You just saved us a whole bunch of, we were going to run out the door with that thing. Thank goodness we talked to some users. And the fantasy is always you're going to get them to stop the presses and start to do it the right way. You're doing it wrong. Stop. We're going to stop everything. We're going to do some research. And then you guys, when we finish the research, you can go, and people are like, we're working on, I love your research idea, but I got a deadline tomorrow. Get back to me, whatever. And then so the people go off and do research and then come back. We just figured out what, it's like, this is not a good time. Like, I don't want to hear that right now. I didn't ask for that. That's not, I have a different question. So when I've had to do something like this, the most recent time I had to do something exactly like that was during the COVID pandemic, when I was volunteering on a project that had just come together and started shipping stuff. And so it's like, you got a team that's like shipping screens, as they call it. And if you ask them if they want any UX help, they're like, yeah, we could use some screen testing, as they called it, meaning usability testing on the screens they were making. And I was like, okay, I got my work cut out for me here. And it wasn't like day one, tell them about the history of UX and product management and backlogs and roadmaps. And I started off saying, what do you need help with? And they're like, no one's doing any QA. And I'm not a QA. I haven't done QA professionally ever, and I've done it half-assed, but I'm not. But I was like, okay, well, I figured out what their current use cases were. I wrote some simple tests. I got the volunteers to start doing QA. A really good QA person joined the project. I handed it, please fix this. He made it all the right way, the more modern way QA is done. And then I said, what else do you need? And I just made myself useful at first. until they trusted me. And then the main point is that you can't do that thing of stop, insert something before and start over. You've got to do this tricky cyclical thing of starting to slip earlier stuff into the next thing and the next thing after that. Which is why you have to be patient, because you can't get to that full on way you'd like to do it in one jump. Nobody can handle that much change. What you can do is start inserting a little bit, prove the value, insert a little bit more, and kind of creating a wedge there where after a while they're saying, why are we rushing into this? We haven't done the research yet. You sort of want them begging for your help, ideally, or asking you to build a team to do that or something. And that, and again, it doesn't happen over. I've never seen it happen quickly, because you've got to persuade a lot of people who aren't yet bought into the value of this, that it's worth dedicating, like really, in some ways, encumbering everything with it.
Yes, the timing is really challenging because the time it takes is to even do a proof of concept research study. You're talking about a point in time where the product team is moving past that. Like
Yeah,
any feedback that you're going to give me is going to be a little bit late, and maybe it'll go in our backlog. And what we've experienced and has worked for us on this topic is looking way down the product roadmap
that's good. I was
and
going to
look
say,
at like
yeah.
what's very
Why
far
don't we
out. And
de-risk some of, let's de-risk some of your future bets and start working on, and then they might see, oh, I wish we had done that with that thing last year. We wouldn't have never done it. And
yeah.
similarly, the other thing that you make a really good point. The other thing about realizing that you're coming in at the, accepting that you're coming in at the end. You wish you weren't, but you're at the end of something already. There are before, during, and after UX research techniques, right? I mean, there's testing you do even after you've shipped. There's lessons you learned on stuff that's already running out the door. And so there's ways to jump on the end of the train and help them evaluate, and then have them wish they had known that stuff earlier, and then start showing them how, oh, we could have been doing that before we shipped. In fact, we could have done fundamental research and we wouldn't even have made that, and so again, you sort of sell the idea in, but you don't oversell it, because you can't deliver huge results quickly, and you can lose your chance to make the case if you promise the moon.
Yeah. I'm going to go to anonymous attendee here. A question that I think there are a number of people, ourselves included, who come from the consultative world, and we're outsiders, right? And we're working with teams, and the question is around, like from your perspective, Christian, you've been both a member of product teams and a third-party consultant. So we're looking for advice that you have for how companies can integrate these service people into the mix, given that they don't necessarily have the same motivations, incentives, success metrics, or whatever. And I would say, as you talk about that, conversely, what does the consultant do to number one, understand that that's the case, and follow on is make it easier for their role to be understood and for them to be successful?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think one thing is figuring out what the consultative mode is of the work or the skills that you're providing, or like how the engagement proposes to help them in that area. So, um, you know, one thing is you can say, oh, this team has no product manager, or this team has nobody attending to the product management functions, and certain problems are happening because some of the things a product manager might have done, like organize the sprints or do retros, or help focus on the right decisions. It could be any number of things, are not happening, or happening kind of passively. So you can realize that what a team needs is just one, somebody fulfilling that role for a while to get a team on track, to get it focused, to get it organized, to get it delivering, to get it defining its goals and measuring them, whatever it's not doing now. Sometimes just, what I call staff augmentation, just being a good product manager for the team, but as a temporary, like a substitute teacher. Obviously, the person's not working for the company full time, not going to get stock options if it's successful, whatever they're doing there. But still, like getting in and saying, okay, no one's cleaned the dishes in this place for a month, so you do the dishes. You sort of start to clean up the situation and make it better. The salutary effect of that is, well, there's two. One is clearly you help the team function better if you deliver that service. But secondly, you're basically modeling for them what needs to be done. And the fact that unless when you're gone, when this engagement's over, other people on that team are going to have to pick up the traces and start, the UX person or someone else who's senior is going to have to do that, or the team's going to have to hire a PM because now they realize, oh, we needed another person on this team. There's a whole bunch of stuff we weren't doing. The other model, and it's more what I've done because I do more leadership consulting and more kind of like helping teams that already exist and stuff like that, has been more like coaching, more like sitting in on them in the meeting with the boss, in the scrum, in the retro, making observations, coaching, supporting, and jumping in. So that's another consultative mode where you can help a team do better product management. Or I think that, I mean, UX has got so much clear IC work that it's more obvious how a strategic consultant might just get in there and do UX work. But I think it's analogous. I think you're often still you're coaching, you're implicitly teaching, you're leveling up a team, or you're guiding them as they try to do the work and be more successful at it. And I think it's quite analogous.
That's great. We have time for one more question, and I'm gonna package two together. And before I do that, I just want to thank everyone for such good questions. I wish we had another half hour here, but there are 2 points in here, and it's funny. I think one of these questions might actually be the answer to the other. So heard this from a design leader at my company. It makes sense. Design is not special; it's essential. And then the other question is, what is design's strategic advantage in a product team? So I mean, use this as the opportunity for you to send us out with the answer to those two statements.
Yeah, that's an interesting. I'm not sure about special versus essential. There's some interesting ideas that need to be unpacked there. Um, I do think of design as a strategic advantage most of the time, and as well as a way of exploring ideas before building them. Because it's hard to build a whole thing and then realize that you could have tried a different idea instead. And so, I mean, I feel like that's where the value always comes from. I think it's worth being aware that there are scenarios where things have succeeded without design or without good design, because other things were because they offered so much value or they were at the right place in the right time. And so therefore not to trust that design will just magically, like you sprinkle design dust on something and it will definitely sell more or get better. I think we have to be thoughtful about where does design make a difference and where does it fit into an overall strategy? What are we trying to get people to do, or what need are we trying to meet? And so it should be, sure, we design an interface that does a task, or that helps a person log in or helps a person update their plan or whatever it is. But overall, our design is trying to create an experience that person returns to again and again. And so there's a gestalt piece to it, I think, where design appears to have that magic quality, that if you don't do it, you don't understand how it works. But if you do it, it's more than every single individual design choice you're making. It's having sort of a design philosophy that cuts across.
That's great. Well, Christian, thank you very much for your time today. This has been excellent. As I mentioned at the top of the call, this will be made available publicly through the Proximity Lab channels. Christian, you feel free to link to it in anything that you have. And you have your website, crumlish.me. And then we are Proximity Lab, a UX research strategy and design agency. So please reach out to us if you have any following questions. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thanks again.
Okay, take care.